South Africa's ANC, a liberation movement, and since the fall of apartheid, a political winning machine. Now, a quarter century on, can the party of Nelson Mandela renew itself? We'll know Wednesday night if voters think so, when ballots are counted in the first general election since Cyril Ramaphosa ousted Jacob Zuma as president. On his predecessor's watch, support for the African National Congress eroded as the inequality that's plagued the Rainbow Nation from the outset continued to grow. We'll ask our panel what medicine to prescribe to curb corruption, the corruption that eventually forced out Zuma, redress imbalances, and what to do about, on the one hand, growing unemployment that's been coupled by regular spates of attacks on immigrants. We're going to be looking at the alternatives to the ANC, which include the breakaway EFF of Julius Malema. He's tapped into popular anger over the deferred promise of farmland redistribution, land still mostly in the hands of whites. On that score, we'll ask how the post-apartheid born-free generation that's come of age in the past decade sees race relations and South Africa's standing as a regional powerhouse whose future is unwritten. Today in the France 24 debate, can Ramaphosa deliver? And joining us, he'll be mixing the mixes at the Venice Art Biennale later this week. Polokwane native DJ and producer Mo Lowdy is with us. Your new EP is called
Dance Inside of You.
Dance Inside of You. Also with us in French, you can read her Lost in Johannesburg blog. Sociologist Bénédicte Champenois-Rousseau, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
From Pretoria, political scientist Kelly Obong Mapunye teaches at UNISA, the University of South Africa. Welcome to the show. And from London, former South African diplomat Darius Jonker, Africa Director at the Eurasia Group. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. We've made some mistakes, admitted a seemingly tired Cyril Ramaphosa at his final campaign rally over the weekend. More on that from France 24's team over there.
He gets a hero's welcome. Since his predecessor Jacob Zuma stepped down, Cyril Ramaphosa has been acting as the ANC's knight in shining armour. At every single rally, he swears he'll eradicate corruption to the delight of his followers.
The president is dealing with it. It's not like corruption is swept under the carpet. It's spoken about, and there are things that will happen to those people who stole money. So the ANC is trying to clean its house. So that is a hope for South Africa.
New scandals emerge on a weekly basis. The country is awash with reports, investigatory commissions and books decrying the supposedly ever more corrupt dealings of ANC leaders. The latest work, Gangster State, paints a lurid portrait of Ace Magashule, Secretary General of the ANC. As the number 2 of the ruling party, he's pocketed millions.
Now that the information is out there on the public record, it really is up to our law enforcement environment and the NPA, our National Prosecuting Authority, to come to the party and ensure that top-level government officials are prosecuted and are made to, account for their transgressions.
Justice for politicians drags on. Accused on more than 700 counts, Jacob Zuma is yet to go on trial. Now living in his villa in Nkandla, his Zulu village, he remains aloof from politics, but is highly active on Twitter, where he posts about relaxing by his pool and being on his quad bike. Analysts believe that the party of Nelson Mandela will end up facing sanctions.
One way or another, the ANC will have to be punished. The question is, how severe will the punishment be? I don't see the ANC, though, failing to win these elections. That is highly unlikely.
With every election, the ANC loses a little ground, but its supporters are once again ready to overlook these misdemeanors.
Yeah, and picking up on what that analyst said, if you believe the polls, the ANC on course to retain a majority of the parliament's 400 seats. This one of the last surveys to come out, and you can see in blue there the numbers from 5 years ago. So yeah, the ANC's numbers go down slightly, but despite all this anger, Mo Lowdy, over corruption, 56%.
It's how the ANC has really won the heart of the people. I mean, it's been the party of the liberation for many years. When I was a child, I remember going around with my father. My father was introducing Nelson Mandela when he came to Polokwane, and then rallying around, and then we helped to start the ANC Youth League in our small section of Polokwane in Step Park. And so that attachment is ingrained, is part of the family fabric. Everybody, at one point, if you're black, you had to love the ANC. And if you...
Even if you're the younger generation, the generation that...
Now there's been a breakaway because there's no longer that attachment. A lot of people were not even born in '94, so now they can vote. So there's been a humongous change.
And for you personally, when you look at this election, is it a given to vote for the ANC?
I spoke to a lot of my friends, and there's going to be a lot of surprises. I think the EFF is going to do a lot.
The party of Julius
Yes,
Malema.
yes. A lot of people are going to vote for EFF.
What's the number one reason why there's disgruntlement?
It's just the ANC. A lot of people have been taking a lot of issues for granted. You know, you're in power. It's like an old relationship where you find, you know, you were in love like many years ago, and then after years and years you neglect the couple. You have to keep on working on making that relationship work. So a lot of people have given up that need to work for the land, and they work for themselves.
All right, we mentioned it in that report, Darius Jonker, corruption, the corruption surrounding public contracts, which has a name in South Africa, state capture. And just as his predecessor was dogged by his link to the Gupta brothers, the state prosecutor investigating whether Cyril Ramaphosa lied to Parliament about a donation from Bosasa, a company that most notably provides services to state prisons. This New York Times report highlighting the fact that the ANC pushed through legislation mandating more transparency, but it's been delayed for just enough time for it not to be implemented for this election cycle. Darius Jonker, how much of a reformer is Cyril Ramaphosa?
Cyril Ramaphosa is significantly committed to economic reform and to an anti-corruption campaign that he hopes will restore the party's image and also revive the economy. Part of the corruption of the Zuma era resulted in economic growth lagging the rest of the world, getting stuck for the past 10 years under 2%. So he really has to revive the sluggish economy. He needs to restore investor confidence. Dealing with corruption is part of that. But it's very important, particularly when we have as much time as we have this evening, to talk about the history of corruption in South Africa, and that it's not a new phenomenon. It's been there for a very, very long time. Since the era of colonialism and later apartheid, there was elite capture of the economy and a political economy which functioned in a way that exploited the black majority, marginalized them, and kept them from the levers of power and the levers of economy. The ANC now has the levers of power, but not yet the levers of the economy. And that transition will lead to another phase of instability in the country's history, and that's the phase we're in now and what we're going into.
It's been 25 years. Why is it taking so long?
Well, if you look at how the political economy of the country has been structured, as it industrialized in the 19th century and in the 20th century, it created a class enriched by mining interests in particular that led to industrial interests, and a very complex, mature economy emerging at the southern tip of Africa. And the leaders of corporate South Africa in the 1980s actively engaged certain parts of the ANC to develop an economic policy which was contradictory to what the ANC had been talking about through the 60s and 70s, which was very socialist, inspired by the Soviet Union, very much focused on nationalization. And so what we saw when Nelson Mandela came to power in '94 was an economic policy that was much more friendly towards the free market. And that slowed the transition of power. And so corporate interests are only now starting to lose power. And this is a planned loss after much of the significant capital that was built up in the country during the 19th and 20th century has now left the country. So it's really a story about one elite handing over the steering wheel very slowly to another elite. And Zuma had a very different idea of how that transition should take place. And he didn't play by the rules. He had a much larger appetite for much more brazen corruption. And so that conflict is essentially the conflict which is inside the ANC at the moment. It's part of the reason why things moved slowly. And it's also part of the reason why there's still an ongoing battle for the soul of the ANC.
Kelly Oboga Mapuine, you could say that Cyril Ramaphosa sort of embodies the two sides of it all. If you look at his own personal history, he starts out as a trade unionist in the fight to end apartheid. He then was a business leader. Is he a reformer?
Some say he is a reformer, but it depends on how you look at it. Those who believe that he is turning the ANC around and bringing about renewal by virtue of the fact that he's a unifier since the party was divided, after the departure of Jacob Zuma, believe that, yes, he is a reformer. He will be able to reform the economy. He's going to be able to reform, the ANC itself as well as government. But if you look at, it from another angle, whereby you know that he has been with the Zuma all these years, that deputy, they almost deputy that, then it's very, very difficult for you to place him.
All right, we seem to have trouble with the Skype connection. Let me ask you, Bénédicte Champenois-Rousseau. Apologies for that. We'll try to fix that as quickly as possible. Jacob Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa. So far, he's been in the job for a year. Has he surprised you in good or bad ways?
Well, I think he performed as expected. I mean, he came to power after a big period of trouble for Jacob Zuma, who was still hanging to the seat and didn't want to leave. And then, he had to reassure the business community. And I guess he made a pretty good job at doing it. But in the meantime, the growth is not back. So he has to...
How much is he going to be hurt by this? There was this donation to his campaign to become president, where first he says, "Oh, it was a gift given to my son," and then, "Oh, yes, it was maybe a campaign donation, but I didn't know about it." Mm-hmm. How much is that going to hurt him?
Well, I guess if you see that Zuma has been able to stay in power for 9 years without being hurt, and just having like 783 charges of corruption or mismanagement hanging to him, and not being able to be ousted out, then I think.
But you heard Moladi at the beginning of the show saying you can perhaps expect surprises.
Yeah, I mean the EFF prospects are quite good. I mean they are doing an excellent job with the young generation. They are very present in the SRC, the Student Representation Councils in the universities. And I mean, they do motivate the youth. They know how to speak to the youth. They know that the youth is not as loyal to the ANC as the parents or grandparents, and the youth has nothing to lose. Basically, they say, well, we're black, we're poor, we're still in townships, and we want to live a real life. We don't want to stay in chains, even if we are supposed to be free. We don't want to stay there. We want to live a real life.
All right, 25 years after the end of apartheid, a majority of the land in South Africa is still owned by whites. That's become a bread and butter issue for Julius Malema. Malema, a former ANC youth wing leader. And there you see the graph on the land ownership by race and by province. Malema, who promises to take land reform to the next level.
We are not fighting against whites. We are fighting to sit on the dinner table. White people, you will no longer eat alone. We are coming to sit on the dinner table, and if you are refusing us on a dinner table, we are going to destroy that dinner table. No one is going to eat until all of us in South Africa eat from the same dinner table.
Now, it's an election campaign, so just how radical is Julius Malema?
He speaks the voice of the people on the ground. The people, that's what the people want to hear. He's direct, he's effective, he challenges. So I do not see him as radical at all, but just speaking the truth.
Could he scare away investors the way Robert Mugabe did in Zimbabwe when he confiscated land from the whites?
There'll always be investors that are scared, but after a while, when the economy starts to grow, they will come back. And the deal is as it is, where the land was stolen. So how do you address these issues where the land has been stolen and some people do not even have the title deeds anymore, and the families have been moved so much to different parts of the land and they don't even know where the grandparents are buried? So we have to look at these issues and address how it can be returned to the people who own it.
All right, we're going to pick up on this point. When we come back, stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're on the eve of a high-stakes general election in South Africa, the first since Cyril Ramaphosa replaced Jacob Zuma as the country's president. The ANC expected to come out tops, but to lose seats once again. We're talking about it with DJ and producer Mo Loudi. His latest EP is
Dance Inside of You.
Dance Inside of You. Sociologist Bénédicte Champenois-Rousseau is with us as well. Her blog, Lost in Johannesburg, is available to those who read in French.
If I may say so, my blog is named Ngisafunda, which means I'm still learning in isiZulu.
Okay. And are you learning it?
Yeah.
You are learning it?
I used to be learning, I used to learn Zulu because...
And you've stopped?
Well, in France, it's not very easy to find an easy Zulu teacher.
With us from Pretoria, political scientist Kelly Obuga Mapuine, who teaches at UNISA, the University of South Africa. Welcome back to the show. Welcome back as well to Darius Jonker, Africa director of the Eurasia Group, former South African diplomat who joins us from London. Darius, you heard just before the break Mo Loudi saying that Julius Malema's message is the one voters want to hear. Do you agree with him?
Well, our expectation is that the economic freedom fighters will see a significant increase in support. If we look at the history of this party, they have their genesis in the ANC. Malema is a former youth league leader of the ANC and a key supporter of Zuma and helped to bring Zuma to power in 2007. He and Zuma fell out, and he broke away from the party and formally registered the Economic Freedom Fighters on the eve of the 2014 election. Then he got about 1 million votes, just over 1 million votes, after having been a formal political party for about 3 months. Then in 2016, we had local government elections across the country. We got about 1.2 million votes. So if we look at the 2019 election, 26 million people have registered. Probably 70% are going to go vote, so that's roughly 20 million. So what percentage of that 20 million votes is Malema going to get? We expect him to get between 10 and 12%. His goal is around 18 to 20%, but we don't think he'll get more than 2 million votes. That's still a significant increase from 2014, basically doubling it. And we do see him on an upwards trajectory.
Kelly Obuga Mapuine, does that add up with your mathematics when you look at Wednesday's vote?
Well, my mathematics is guided by the public opinion polls that have been almost very accurate about the three big parties, that is the DA, the ANC, as well as the EFF. But if you want to focus on Malema and the EFF, The opinion polls have obviously been signaling that it's quite likely to come out, the third, best, just like it happened in the previous elections, the previous general elections in 2014, and at the national level. And at the provincial level, this is where the party has been, eating into much of the ANC's and the DA support. So there's quite likely to be heavy contestation depending on what province we're looking at, whether it's here in Johannesburg, Pretoria, Gauteng, or whether it's in the Western Cape or in the other provinces like KwaZulu-Natal, down in Durban and so on. But overall, the party, the EFF, it has mixed messages. Mostly it's supported by, predominantly black youth or the younger generation among the black, population. Partly because it has been pressing the right buttons around some of the things that the ANC is quite scared to talk about, or that the ANC would rather be reformist to talk about, like things of land, things of, redistribution of, the wealth and so on and so on. So much of what, the party does is obviously to capitalize on, that weakness, but also, as my colleague says, Malema and many of his, colleagues or comrades, as they call themselves, are mostly coming from the governing African National Congress. And so they know the strategies that are normally used. Some of the popular strategies to try and win the vote. Of course, there are some, people who are alienated by the radical rhetoric of the Malema, campaigns, messages. Some of which are just across, physical, they threaten physical violence, like. We're talking about, going to the dinner table. If they cannot share the dinner table, they will destroy it. It for me, sounds like a baby or a child that wants to throw tantrums, and when they can't get their way. And unfortunately, they have not been able to get their way since 2014, even though we do acknowledge that their support has been increasing steadily.
All right, so you're playing down there the saying there's a ceiling for how many votes Julius Malema's EFF can get. And you mentioned something important there, which is the fact that these are going to be not just parliamentary elections, but also elections in each province. The ANC looking to retain control overall on that score. Here we can draw up a map for you. And you have, though, this time around where it's going to be close, particularly in economically strategic Gauteng. That's home to Johannesburg and Pretoria. And that's where the party that got the most votes in the opposition last time around, the centrist Democratic Alliance, hopes to make inroads by forging coalitions with local parties.
If the rights of the minorities are going to be protected, they are going to be protected by the majorities. Because our project is no longer about freedom fighting. It is about freedom protecting and enhancing.
Your thoughts on the DA's message there, Mo Laudi?
The DA always, some of my family members are DA. So
are you about to say something that's going to annoy them? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating because they come from the background is forged by the National Party and the Democratic Party, and so there's still an element where the older generation of South Africans, black South Africans, feel that there's racism inside. So no matter how much they change, or it seems like a facade, and there's not a true conviction that has been able to move the large majority of the black people in South Africa. So,
but they managed to win provinces and do well last time around.
Yes, where largely people are moving away from the ANC. They don't see an alternative. They find...
So they got votes from black people.
Yes, they do. Yes. Generally, there is a movement towards that with the new face and to attract more black people inside.
And their message is moderation. So which way is South Africa going?
Well, I think the main handicap for the DA is it's still massively perceived as a white party. no matter how many black people there are really in the party, because there are black leaders in the party, but it's still largely white. And we're speaking of racism. I mean, the Twitter feed of Hélène Zille was quite frightening sometimes. I mean, and the black population was quite repelled from that, and it was very conveniently, retweeted, etc., etc. So they have quite a moderated speech. I think on the social issues, they are kind of honest. I mean, I read a lot of things because my point of interest is healthcare. I read a lot of what they wrote on healthcare, and it was very interesting. I mean, when you see the state of the public hospital in South Africa, of the public health system, I mean, it's failing people. When you see the scandals like Life Esidimeni, or when you see that they can't deliver proper healthcare in the provinces, then you say, well, they have a point. I mean, they have a good rhetoric. They have good analysis.
But then is it different in the Western Cape?
The hospital and the school system are still a little better in the Western Cape.
Darius Jonker, your thoughts on this? Because one of the big problems, of course, is we've seen public services which have really eroded, you might say, in South Africa. What comes to mind when we talk about this is the state utility, Eskom. But you heard there, Bénédicte Champenois-Rousseau mentioned the healthcare system. We could talk about the education system. Where's South Africa going?
Well, I worked for the South African government for just under a decade, and I could see how standards were slipping towards the end of my time there. In my view, it's a problem across government, national government, provincial government, local government. And you can debate the reasons. I'm somebody who always likes to go back to the history and to look back 100, 150 years and that kind of thing to try and think where we'll be in 5 or 10 years' time. But the reality is that Ramaphosa's got a massive challenge ahead of him. He's got dozens of top senior directors general that he needs to appoint permanently at the helm of government departments. He's got to ensure the best people that he can serve in those positions, serve in cabinet. But it's a challenge because the ANC has a stated policy of cadre deployment, which means ANC members get these jobs in government. And because of the factionalism within the party, Ramaphosa cannot necessarily appoint the best person from the ANC to that job. He has to appoint somebody from different factions, from different constituencies to keep everybody happy and to keep everybody unified. He's dog whistling that will change, but I'm not expecting that. I think the nature of the system means that you'll continue to see people who are not necessarily well suited for these positions to fill those positions.
All right, dog whistling of a more alarming kind has been witnessed of late, and that is regarding migrants in a country where there's resentment, over 27% unemployment, some blaming foreigners. Caroline Dumais and Stephen Karstens have that story.
He was left for dead on the side of the highway, and when he looks back over the pictures of himself, Tina Takawira remembers all too well. He was stabbed because he was Zimbabwean.
Said, yeah, we are foreigner. Don't want no need of foreigners here. We are driving a taxi. Us is not working.
It's a miracle that this driver is still alive. One of his friends was less fortunate. 2 weeks ago, he was burnt alive in his truck. South African hauliers employ large numbers of foreign workers. Attacks are frequent.
This is the reality in the transport industry. Though authorities, they try to sanitize it to regard it as a criminal event, but there's element of xenophobia in place.
Attacks on working immigrants reflect South Africa's frustrations over growing unemployment, and the authorities regularly fan the flames by promising to control the borders. Immigration has been a campaign topic for all the political parties. Last week, the mayor of Johannesburg spoke out about his concerns.
There can be no doubt that immigration crisis in our country, it's actually contributing pressure on government to provide services with our limited funding. As I've just really indicated, another practical example in our clinics, where presently we get between 25 and 39% of people visiting our clinics being undocumented people.
Without a census, no one knows how many foreigners live in South Africa. But migrants' associations urge the authorities to stop stigmatizing them.
If we trace 2008, 2015, and again now this election season, there's this pattern of eruption with xenophobia and a large denialism within politicians.
Tine and his friends are keeping their heads down in the hope they'll be able to keep working. They've been living legally in South Africa for 10 years and have nowhere to go.
What's your reaction there when you hear the mayor of Johannesburg, Mo Laudi, talking about undocumented people putting a burden on the hospital system?
It's an unfortunate truth that exists. I mean, I believe in a borderless world where people can move freely. I'm a Pan-Africanist. And then there's a system of apartheid that has created fear of the foreigner. You know, black people feared other black people. And when you come from even just across the border, there's even more fear. So that fear is instilled within the South African culture. So
how do you explain those spikes, those regular spikes in violence against foreigners?
It's poverty. Our people are so poor, they have nothing. So when you have a large influx of foreign people moving to a poor area, those poor people immediately see the outsider as the person who's taking their jobs, even though they might not have jobs, even though they might not even do those jobs. So, yeah, it's fear.
Bénédicte Champenois-Rousseau, what have you found on that score in your fieldwork?
Well, there's a big difference between foreigners and locals. I mean, I worked on maternity, and on maternity, well, I thought it was great that South African hospitals were giving, a chance to women and foreign women to go and to the maternity wards in the hospitals. But the treatment was different from one site to another. In some sites, there were, like in Diepsloot, for instance, they have a lot of migrants, and they have, I think, they know how to deal with them, and they are very comprehensive and very understanding. And in some other hospitals, they are quite rejecting the foreigners, and you have a lot of stories of women, giving birth in the street or in the taxi or in the how train. I think 2 years ago, there was this Congolese woman giving birth in the how train because she was driven out of Pretoria. Pretoria Hospital told her, well, you can't give birth here, go to Johannesburg. She went to Charlotte Maxeke, and there they said, well, no, we can't have you here, go to Hillbrow, and then she finally gave birth in the how train.
Kelly Oboga Mapuine, I recall being in Nigeria in 2015 when there were attacks on the Nigerian community in South Africa. Going forward, what's going to be the country's standing across the continent as a power if these regular spikes in attacks continue?
Unfortunately, South Africa happens to, be seen as this country that is xenophobic, or a country whose citizens are xenophobic. But in my view, it's actually not xenophobia, which is the fear of the foreigner. But in my view, it is fear of the African, migrant, which is what I prefer to call Afrophobia. Because I don't see, Bosnian migrants or, those people who have come from the wars in Bosnia and outside, the continent being targeted. Of course, there are Pakistanis, but there are not so many. Mostly it is what we can call, for want of a better phrase, black Africans. So the what is going to happen, or what I think needs to happen, once the new government has been installed, is to revisit this policy around migration, because many of the black people believe that the government has sort of, loosened its grip in terms of immigration policy. They say it's more like a free-for-all, that South Africans, are inundated. They are flooded by people who are crossing borders without being documented, with, illegally so, and to cap it all. There are, there's confusion between the refugees, those people who are running away from the wars, and economic migrants. So to that extent, for me, I think it is tightening, in terms of ensuring that those who are coming in, they are coming in, they are well documented, and of course they are well protected by the government in terms of the constitution, which says that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. It does not exclude, the people who are coming in as migrants in the case of these people that are being accused of stealing jobs and so on.
Darius Jonker, you're sitting in London where there was a Brexit vote. In part, the feeling for that vote was fueled by an anti-immigrant sentiment. Your thoughts on a nation, South Africa, that wants its standing as, rightfully so, a major power on the world stage, and at the same time has to, set these border limits?
South Africa has a very idealistic foreign policy, and Ramaphosa is certainly underlining that, wanting to reignite the sentiment of the Mandela era that South Africa must be a guiding light, a shining light, championing human rights around the world. So he is deeply embarrassed about xenophobia, and it's certainly something he's trying to address at a multitude of multilateral and bilateral meetings that he has with world leaders. However, the reality about foreign policy and foreign relations, it's about who's the most powerful, and to have power you need money. So if you look at how powerful South Africa is at the moment, it's been struggling economically for over 10 years. Southern Africa as a whole in the last 4 or 5 years has not been doing very well, whereas West Africa and East Africa have been doing very well. The strongest growing economies on the continent are no longer in Southern Africa. Southern Africa is losing its status as the engine of the African economy. So in that sense, in the African context, the African Union, South Africa will no longer be the leading light it once was, and also internationally. If you look at the UK, it's prioritizing South Africa as one of the countries with which to build its trade and investment relations post-Brexit. But because of the complexity and the delays in the Brexit process, taking up so much political energy and resources, the UK economy is showing that, there's not so much the UK can do for South Africa. The same for the United States. Donald Trump has been president. He's halfway through his presidency. There's still no ambassador in Pretoria. So the only major world power that is significantly invested in South Africa's future at the moment is China. China's human rights record speaks for itself. And so it's a very interesting dynamic that will play itself out over the coming years, where South Africa wants to champion this Mandela-era policy of human rights, but it's doing so without much of an economic foundation, with declining power, and being forced to work more closely with China. And you see it in South Africa's voting record at the UN Security Council, where it votes more with China and Russia and less with the US and the West.
Right,
and that is often seen as not being very pro-human rights.
All right, one of the challenges that faces the next government in South Africa. Darius Jonker, I want to thank you for joining us from London. I want to thank Kelly Oboga Mapuine for being with us from Pretoria. Mo Laudi Benedict Champenois Rousseau. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.
Great.
And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
No shortages of opinions on the eve of South Africa's vote.
No, definitely not. There does seem to be a real focus on the inequality within South Africa, and nowhere more so really than the front cover of Time magazine, which is getting a lot of attention. It has a really stark and startling image on the front page. The world's most unequal country is the headline, and those are the Johannesburg suburbs, very much a dividing line, that road there between the haves and the have-nots. It almost looks, it's so obvious that it almost looks like it's faked, but it's not. It was taken with a drone by a photographer named Johnny Miller. There is an article within Time which is very well worth a look, but the images really are the star of the show with this. It is incredible just how much they are butted up against one another. That's in Cape Town, and in Durban you've got a golf course right next to those slums. And you have got 23% of people in South Africa living in slums. That's according to the latest Spectator Index figures. People using this front cover really as a rallying point. South Africa Summarised, says this gentleman, and this woman saying, no better motivation to go out and vote than this cover. Good luck on Wednesday, South Africa. And there is an awful lot of, well, underwhelmed people out there, to say the least, to put it politely, really. Zapiro, of course, the very well-known cartoonist, penned this particular one for the Daily Maverick. It's entitled Crappy Choice, and you can see that the ballot paper is, in fact, toilet paper. So not to impress there. And that's also being echoed on social media with the hashtag I want to vote but. Lots and lots of responses on this one. It's like deciding who to make rich from your taxes, says this one. What if they reject my vote the same way they've been rejecting my CV? And this one too, saying, my parents have been voting since 1994 and they're still living in a shack while the people they were voting for are in mansions. And that issue of poverty and not feeling that their situation has got any better is absolutely everywhere. This cartoon shows that really, with this Twitter user saying, I know once you vote for them, you won't see them again until another election comes around. And you've got all of the candidates there, manicures, shoe polishing, fanning him. And it's making a big fuss of the voter right now, but they will be forgotten about, which is the theme as well of this article, which is really quite stunning. The perspective here from News 24. They've been to visit a family of 9, the parents and 7 children, who live in a one-room house. And what they say is, I don't know what I'm voting for. You can understand why. The husband said, we are nothing to our politicians. They have no running water. They have to, the little bit of money that they do have, they have to spend on water to be able to drink. So it's understandable that they really can't see what any politician is going to do for them if they actually make the effort to go out and vote tomorrow.
And we've been seeing this, our correspondent Aisha Ismail saying there were a lot of people who said they would perhaps not cast their ballots.
Absolutely. There's between 9 and 10 million who haven't even bothered to register. So it'll be interesting to see of those who are registered, how many actually vote.
All right, many thanks for that, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.